Do you ever stop and think about the persons around you? The non-human ones, the animals. A new book explores what happens to our ethics and our lives when we pay attention to the beings with whom we share the world. Author Brandon Keim's Meet the Neighbors, next on the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights. Brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, what happens when you really see the animals around you? Not just your dog or cat, but the birds outside, the raccoons and deer on your back porch. Would you eat them, wear them, use them for your amusement, experiment on them? Brandon Keim is a journalist and now author who explores how our lives change when we stop and really notice the animals with whom we share the world. His new book is Meet the Neighbors, Animal Minds and Life in a More Than Human World. My conversation with author Brandon Keim on this edition of the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo. So, Brandon Keim, thank you very much for being part of the PETA Podcast. It's great to meet you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Emil. Thank you.
And, of course, the occasion is the publication of your new book, Meet the Neighbors, Animal Minds and Life in a More Than Human World. I mean, the title says it all, really. I mean, you didn't even have to write the book. We can, if we were able to, just intuit everything. There it is. It's right there. But Meet the Neighbors, you're not talking about Billy and Bobby Smith next door. You're not talking about the guy and gal next door.
Yes, not the folks next door, not the people on next door, but the animals who live all around us. And I should also say, not only the animals who live in backyards and parks and on Earth at this moment. It truly, the whole planet is truly a shared place.
It's kind of blunt, meet the neighbors, and people will think, oh, they're thinking the human ones, but you're thinking about all the other ones, and that's because we don't notice them, do we?
We don't notice them, and there's really this push to see humans and nature not as intrinsically separate, but really is joined, which I think is a wonderful thing, and there's such a desire out there to appreciate other animals as kin. So there's a story early on in the book where I'm living in Bethesda, Maryland, and so it's a very leafy suburb, and it took a while for me to wrap my head around it because it is simultaneously a very developed and anthropogenic space. But there is so much greenery and so much growing. And every time you walk outside, there's birds and small mammals and deer and so much more wildlife than I was expecting in such a human space. And so anyways, there was this stormwater retention pond that I lived beside on the edge of the National Institutes of Health campus. And every morning I'd go to the stormwater pond, and there was a little, inlet stream running into it from the city drainage system, and I would sit by this little stream with weeds and what have you growing on the banks, and every day, I would always see the birds bathing in the stream, and it was really a wonderful way. There were song sparrows and house sparrows and catbirds and mockingbirds and cardinals and starlings and the whole neighborhood menagerie. And after a while, it really dawned on me that, I was seeing the same birds over and over. This was their morning ritual, just to, really in much the same way as, I would go and sit by the stream too. It was like we were, meeting up at the diner or at the YMCA every morning. And it just really sunk into me then. It's not like they were living in my space or I was living in their space, but it really truly was a shared space, and we were just neighbors.
Yeah, it's funny. I live near that same place, that old part of Bethesda with those old brick row houses, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, and I did notice that about living in Bethesda, that it was green, and that in the summertime, the lightning bugs, and as a California kid like me, I mean, I'm an adult, but there I was with my kids, and they're like, "What are those? What are those bugs lighting? Lighting up your dad?" And I said, "Are they firecrackers?" I said there was just an awareness of the differences in the animals and the beings around us, wherever you live, East Coast, West Coast, Bethesda. So it's what a coincidence. And so you mentioned this, that there's this growing awareness. What happened so that we are now more aware? I mean, you're writing this book because it's sort of landmarking or benchmarking this milestone that, hey, we didn't discover these animals before, or we didn't notice them. Now we are. What do you think has happened that people are now starting to say, yeah, they're there?
There are several factors that are involved in that. So it's not like the idea of other animals as thinking, feeling beings is brand new to Western society, right? It's something that a great many people have believed and understood for millennia, but it's been a very unevenly distributed idea. I'm going to say, when I was growing up, it was perfectly normal to think of my dog or my cat, as a someone, right? You live with them, they're intelligent unless you're really oblivious to them. But that's just not the lens through which I saw, well, certainly not the animals who I consumed or the animals who are used for research. I mean, I didn't even see them, right? They're essentially invisible. But it wasn't how I saw wild animals necessarily either. And so, when I was a kid, I went fishing a lot, and I liked those fish. I bore absolutely no animosity to those fish. I didn't want to hurt them. And yet at the same time, like, I was sticking a hook into their mouths. They were wriggling around on the end of the line trying to escape. Yet for whatever reason, I think just because of the way, we were socialized growing up, it didn't really occur to me, or I didn't feel it in my bones, that was an individual on the other end of the line, experiencing that. And I think that kind of, bifurcated sense of awareness is something that, is really, is very characteristic of how people in the Western world have been socialized to think about animals, for centuries now, and certainly in the period of time when I was growing up. And then there's also, a great big history to be said about the history of the science of animal intelligence, and, the ways in which Enlightenment science really officially considered other animals to be unintelligent in any meaningful way. And even though you would still have people, who appreciated animal intelligence, those views were kind of not considered formal knowledge.
So let's talk just briefly about that concept of animal intelligence. What do you mean by that? Because we humans think of intelligence as doing well on a test or in a career. How do you come to see intelligence in the other than human animals?
So, one way, of course, is just the common sense way of knowing and interacting with these creatures, but that doesn't carry much scientific weight. From the time of the Enlightenment up until the late 19th century, science really just said, no, animals don't have a lot going on. And there was a brief thawing in that. There was kind of a pushback that Charles Darwin was a big part of. And then the pendulum swung back. And for the 20th century, animals were scientifically considered unintelligent. But there was really this flourishing towards the end of the 20th century of scientists who were pushing back against that notion and really studying it in very rigorous ways. And the way that science kind of evolved is that, early on in the 70s and 80s and 90s, most of the research was much more about, testing the sorts of memory, whether animals remembered things, or they could solve puzzles, or, or sort of do things that are easily observable and that you can empiricize. And then at the same time, of course, there's the studies of the anatomical studies of animal minds, the way that as we develop a greater understanding of our own intelligence, we can also then take those lessons and look to animals to see how they process things and think things through. And that early emphasis on kind of the classic forms of intelligence, the information processing and pattern recognition and so on, you know, was then joined by a lot more research on emotions and subjectivity. And those are things that historically were kind of considered impossible to study because how do you know what's going on in the mind of another human being, much less an animal? But there are very clever study designs that can get at that. And again, it's not like you need the science to have that awareness. When you look at the rise of the modern animal rights movement in the mid 20th century, the science didn't exist at the time. But, people could still say, hey, listen, cows, pigs, these animals, these are somebody's. But what the science has done recently is just make it so inescapable that animal intelligence is everywhere and not just in a few extra smart species, all over the place.
And what's interesting is you talk about the modern animal rights movement. I mean, here we have this now new wave of recognition of animal intelligence. But at the beginning of animal rights, the idea really was about animals' feelings and animals feeling pain. And so now we've sort of gone into the more intellectual side. Well, it's not more than just pain. They're smart. There's an intelligence there. And give us some more examples of how that sort of changed thinking about what goes on when an animal is looking at you or when you are looking at the animal, what they're not just feeling, but what they're thinking.
Well, there's a couple lines of research I would love to talk about here. So this isn't necessarily about the animal looking back at us, but it's very much about who that animal is who's looking back at us. So the subject of self-awareness is something that is, scientifically been very contested when it comes to animals. And so self-awareness, of course, it is just this bedrock part of our own experience of the world. It's really, I would argue it is literally impossible to imagine experience without having a sense of self. No matter what you do, if you're scratching an itch or taking a bite of food or seeing someone, or waving to someone, there's always that awareness that you are you and you are distinct from the outside world and you have a sense of yourself as an entity existing across time, right? Like this is just central to the human experience. But until very recently, the gold standard for studying self-awareness in other animals was what's called the mirror self-awareness test, or mirror self-recognition test. And the way that these tests are done is that, a scientist will make a mark on an animal on some part of their body that they can't actually see, and they'll make this mark surreptitiously, like putting a little dab of paint on the back of your head while you're asleep or something. And then the idea is that if later on the animal using a mirror, looking at themselves in the mirror, discovers that mark and then investigates it with their hand, then you can say, oh, well, they're self-aware, right? They have a mental self-image, and then they see a reflection in the mirror that doesn't correspond to that self-image, and they're like, oh, hey, what's going on here? So they touch their head, or they touch that mark, and that you can infer that they have that self-image. But if going by the mirror test alone, then bottlenose dolphins pass it, Asian elephants, orangutans, I think. There's also evidence for manta rays, and I think maybe magpies, and more recently cleaner wrasse fish have passed the test. But it's just a handful of species, and you could say, well, is self-awareness something that is only possessed by a handful of species, which is a hypothesis that has really kind of been blown out of the water, both by versions of the mirror self-recognition test that don't use mirrors. Let's say you can test whether an animal, recognizes their own odor. It could sort of surmise from that their sense of the self is is mediated more by olfaction than sight. So dogs, for instance, dogs don't recognize themselves in mirrors, but they'll have this, olfactory self-image, quote unquote, or self-scent. There's other scientists and philosophers who've said, well, we need to stop thinking about self-awareness as kind of this all or nothing thing, right? Either you've got this incredibly sophisticated form like we have, or you've got none at all. And actually, it was the late ethologist Franz de Waal who said this. Think about self-awareness like the layers of an onion, and those layers are composed of memory and different forms of cognition and what have you. But at the center of that is just this, what they call pre-reflective self-awareness, just kind of being aware of your own body in this really central way. And the experiment that I love involved rat snakes. And so rat snakes eat rats. And, kind of when they eat a rat, it's like that cartoon image, their slender body, and then a big ball of rat in the middle, and then the body. And so, the researchers will set up an enclosure where, you have a divider in the middle that has two holes, a little hole and a big hole, and the snake has to go from one side to the other. And so if they have not eaten, they'll take the smaller hole, right? Like it's just there, it makes sense. But after they've eaten, they'll use the big hole. And it's not like they do it randomly. It's not like they try the small hole and then they're like, well, I can't fit through this, so I guess I'll go through the other. But they just go through the big hole because they're aware of the dimensions of their body expanding. And that just gets at this sense of self that some scientists and philosophers now argue is really just foundational across all vertebrates and a great many invertebrates, and it's kind of not that it's certainly not rare. And it's just, for me, these things historically, what makes us human has always been conceived of as what makes us different from other animals. But I think the better way to think about what makes us human is just, what is really important to us. And one of those things that's just so foundational is a sense of self. And it's something we share across the animal kingdom.
So it seems now from these studies that animals are self-aware, some animals more self-aware than humans, but it's something we share, and it's something that we have failed to acknowledge, but with more discussion, more research now, we can't ignore that fact, right? That there's real intelligence, there's a real awareness, and we really aren't alone. The animals are there. They're smart. They are with us, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I should add to that too. And they have meaningful relationships in the world too, right? This being another thing that's so important to us. We're not just isolated, discrete individuals, but bound up in communities, and we have friends and family, and those relationships are so important to many animal species as well. And just there's so this awareness that we've been talking about, the premise of my book is that it's something, people are having those conversations about animals used for food or research or labor, and the progress hasn't happened in the way that we want it to, or as consistently as we want it to, but people are thinking about it. But when it comes to nature, that realization has sort of been much slower to percolate out into the world. And that's what Meet the Neighbors is about. What happens when we take these ideas onto the landscape?
And then we encounter these animals and their animal minds. And then the implication is that we have to adapt and change to this life in a more than human world, which is part of your subtext or subtitle.
Mm-hmm. Completely. I think it's, there's first, well, even before when, changing and adapting, I think part of it is just appreciating it, right? Like it's such a much richer and more interesting world full of minds who are not human. And then kind of after the discussion of animal intelligence in the book, I have stories of people, who are living out what this means, and whether that's reforming quote unquote the quote unquote control of quote unquote pests, or finding ways of coexisting with coyotes, or caring for animals at wildlife hospitals, or thinking about how wildlife management can be done differently if you appreciate animals this way. there's so many ways that these ideas can grow in the world, and I talk about a few of them.
Well, but just the basic idea of, well, I guess if you understand that animals have feelings, that's one level that has been around to justify animal rights for the longest time. But now if you understand that they have animal minds and that there's an intelligence here and a self-awareness, can people really justify eating them and exploiting animals in the way they do?
I think that so the answer for myself is mostly no, and I'll say mostly when so first of all, in the first 40 years of my life, I ate enough animals for several people. I grew up at a time when if a dish did not have meat in it, it wasn't really a meal, right? So so I definitely do not have any moral high ground that I'm making these pronouncements from. But over time, that's something that I just chose not to do because those animals became a someone. Although that being said, when someone serves me a meal that they've made, I'll still eat animals in that case because partly because I'm conflict averse, but also because I think that accepting hospitality is an important value. And every now and then, just because I'm not a good or consistent person, and this is something that happens with baked goods specifically, I'll buy a muffin or I'll buy a cookie that I'm not thinking too hard about what the ingredients are, and deep down inside I know, and I don't feel good about this. But that being said, I think there are a multitude of values in the world, and I think the world would be a far better place if everybody were vegan. And I don't think you can we can justify killing other animals or making other animals live short lives dominated by negative experiences. I don't think we can justify that in the name of food. But I am open to the idea that maybe somehow there could be systems where we're eating animals and those animals genuinely live lives that you or I would want to live, right? That satisfies the golden rule. But I haven't seen those yet. And I'm open to the possibility. I would love to see them, but I haven't yet.
A lot of it also, if one does exploit, eat, use animals, a lot of it comes from a justification that, well, they're there for our use. We are superior. We are higher up on the food chain. I mean, there's that justification too. Does the emergence of the awareness that there's animal intelligence, there's animal emotion, does that change things or begin to change this idea of human superiority?
Oh, I think absolutely. Having that recognition does not always come with equality, but I think it's just so important that sense of who animals are, it needs to be part of the ethical equation, right? However you calculate that, whatever your moral calculus is, that sense of who animals are needs to be a part of it. And I should also add, well, after I stopped consuming animals for, almost entirely, I would still, so when I was in airports, I would still cheat with breakfast sandwiches. And it was almost like there's like something about like an airport terminal that kind of makes it this like zone of moral suspension. I don't know what's going on with the
Right.
psychology there, right? But for like whatever reason, I could just sort of set aside my values when I was waiting for the plane. Um
You're in
and
transit. You're in transit.
right, it's a strange thing. But anyways, I started learning a lot more. So I should also say that in addition to the science, there's been this, wonderful burst of thinking from the humanities and the social sciences about animals in the last 20 years. And one of the ideas that's come out of that is the idea of thinking of other animals as laborers, as doing work, right? And so then the argument against, let's say, not consuming battery house chickens isn't only the isn't only the pain that those chickens experience, but also the fact that they are exploited workers in a sense. And there was so when I was, so one day was I was there waiting for a flight, and I was looking at like a $2 breakfast sandwich, and like it's dropped in my mind. I'm like, you know what? Like that chicken lived a short, awful life, and the cow, who provided the milk that became the cheese, had a miserable life, and all got out of it was what, like 10 cents out of that $2. Like the unfairness of the labor relations of that was so striking that in some way it resonated with me just as much as the other arguments. And I have not eaten an airport breakfast sandwich or any other breakfast sandwich since then.
Sometimes, you discover what the chord is that is struck in your heart when you see these things, and it's a combination of emotion and the intellectual, but it also boils down to whether you see the animal as a person. And
Yeah.
you're a writer, I'm a writer. Sometimes, you come across this when you consider the pronouns. We're all into pronouns now as humans, but how about for the animal? And if you see the animal as a person, this is a serious discussion. Well, what do you mean by personhood, and how does your explorations, your writing, how does that, what does that say about recognition of the personhood of animals?
Mhm. So, on the subject of pronouns, there's just an anecdote I'd like to recount. So,
Sure.
so a few years ago, there was a cow who was being transported to a slaughterhouse in Queens, New York, and and the cow somehow got loose and ran through the streets of Queens for a morning and kind of became a momentary celebrity. And then fortunately, the attention that generated was enough that when the cow was captured again, she was taken to an animal sanctuary and escaped her fate. But so anyhow, kind of the first story that was published about this, episode in the New York Times, kind of as it was happening, described the cow as an it. It ran through the streets of New York or whatever. And then later on, there was, the follow-up story, and more information had been learned about the cow at that time. And the story described the cow as who. And so Peter Singer wrote into the New York Times and said, well, I appreciate the fact that you used who in the second article, but I would, could you explain how it is that the it went, that the it turned into a who? And so the ombudsman replied that this was the official style, that an animal was considered an it, which is to say you use the same word to describe it, as you would for a rock or a toaster or any other inanimate object. An animal is an it until either the sex is identified or they've been given a name, at which point it is then correct to use the animate pronoun to call them a who, a someone. And this is so obviously arbitrary and completely ridiculous, right? I mean, if the animal is a who, once you've bothered to notice them, then the animal is a who, even if you haven't. But so that episode just has always really stuck with me. And of course, the importance then of calling someone a who. Let's say if you call someone you love it, and Robin Wall Kimmerer articulates this very beautifully in Braiding Sweetgrass, where she's talking about, imagine calling your grandmother as she's standing there at the stove, making a stew. Imagine describing her as it, and something in you, your stomach clenches, right? It's so dehumanizing. And so I think it's imperative to describe animals as a who, because of course there are persons. And then to get back to your question about what is personhood, ultimately, it's one of those words that, it's so simple and yet it can be so nuanced. But, the philosopher Kant would have said a person is someone who, is an end in themselves rather than a means to someone else's end. And the late Steve Wise of the Non-Human Rights Project would say, well, in a legal sense, an animal is, a person is any entity who is capable of having a right, whether they're a human or an animal or not. That's what it means to be a person, to have a right. And just the way I think about, animal and or person in my head, is, with language that I'm sure will be familiar to many of the people listening to this, it's a someone, not a something.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the key word, right. I guess Meet the Neighbors, your new book, is or does have an animal rights perspective.
Absolutely. I would say an animal rights, both in the legal sense. And, I write extensively about the Non-Human Rights Project. I also sort of write about other ideas that, are really going, beyond individual rights to talk about political representation and kind of incorporating the perspectives of animals and the well-being of animals into, social and political institutions and the decisions that are made, which affect them. So there's that category of more formalized rights, but then there's also the more everyday rights, the things that aren't decided in a court of law, but really are just a matter of how we treat one another and how we think about one another's interests. And there's so much every one of us can do in those settings and in relation to the animals, who are, in our backyards or who our lives intersect with. And there's rights in those settings as well. And I think they're really within people's grasp.
Oh, give me an example. What is a way that one can respect the rights of an animal in that context?
So, conflict with free living animals who live around us, whether you want to call it wildlife conflict or conflict with quote unquote pests. One of some of the favorite people in the favorite characters in my book, are those who have really pioneered the work of humane wildlife conflict resolution, right? And so obviously not killing a squirrel who finds his way into your attic or a groundhog chewing on in your vegetable garden. So obviously, of course, not killing is a very basic step. But then there's but also not trapping them, not trapping and relocating them, recognizing that they have every much of a right to be there as you do. And there's a man in Toronto named Brad Gates, who's really pioneered this field. And one of his innovations is that, when he takes a raccoon, and often it's a raccoon mom and her babies, out of somebody's attic or out of their garage, he just releases them outside, right? Because this is their home. They have other places to go. They know this place. They're not going to survive, or their chances of survival are very slim if you just drop them off in some random place, much less out in the wilderness where they didn't grow up, right? These are suburban creatures just like us. So even something as simple as that, finding ways of living with the animals around us who maybe you have a little bit of tension with.
Yeah. Well, it just the sense is that there's just a general kindness that we lack when we approach these animals.
Absolutely. And, I think just the golden rule, right? Do unto others. It works in so many ways, in every setting, and very much with animals.
But are they others or are they people? Are they the others? Are they persons that we should respect?
Do unto other persons. Do unto every person. Have them do unto
you. You hinted earlier in your answer about the courts and the legal system, and PETA has these lawsuits that they've done, and one of the stories that has come down in the last couple of years, the Naruto case, right? The who owns the rights of if an animal clicks the shutter, are the rights to his image of a selfie, the animal selfie, is it the rights go to the photographer, or does the right go to the animal? And it's funny because the animals don't communicate in a way that humans do. People might have the impression that, oh, well, then they have no rights if they can't communicate. And so it gets complex. And it's almost like, well, all right, so maybe a compromise is to look at the animal as one would look at a human who is otherwise mentally, incapacitated, or, not as, a somewhat disabled person. And how do you sort through all that in terms of the legal view of whether an animal has rights?
So, so I would say, in that framework of kind of, finding, sort of finding human analogs for how to understand their rights or their interests. I think the example of humans who are not capable of articulating their interests in, verbally or linguistically, those give us some very good examples, right? You can have say, certainly an infant or an elderly person who has dementia, and they're no longer capable of articulating their rights, but someone else can, in good faith, represent their rights and interests for them, and their rights and interests are respected. So I think there's a very good precedent there. Although I'm just a little careful with those analogies, just because I think it can be kind of easy to then think of, I'm looking at a cardinal outside. I'm going to say, so to think of this cardinal I'm looking at as being, somehow lesser, right? Of being like a mentally disabled human, which of course is not the case, right? Like that cardinal is every bit as, competent and in their world as I am in mind. And actually they're doing a much better job of living off the trees than I would in their feathers.
And they can fly.
And they can fly. So I wouldn't want to make animals seem lesser by these comparisons, but I think those frameworks are useful. And I would also add here, and I love that you brought up the case of Naruto, because I think that is just such a intellectually compelling case. And that's part of why it was like such a, that's something that really captured the imaginations and made people think. And it appealed to so many people, not just animal rights activists, right? But really everybody, because the ideas there about, about fairness and about thinking of that monkey as having created something of value. I mean, those are just really interesting, compelling ideas. But I would even like to push that example a little bit further. And, so right now I'm kind of looking out at it. There's some fields right outside my window, and then the edge of the forest up against them. And so everything I'm looking at around me was created by animals, right? The soil I'm looking at is the labor of, countless invertebrates and small burrowing mammals, and then the birds who regulate their populations. And, this whole world that I'm looking at, it didn't just kind of spontaneously come into being, but it too is the creation of animal life and animal labor. And I kind of like to think, what do we owe them in return? Because this is their creation.
Right. So it's more than just animal rights. It's animal gratitude, animal, offering our sense of our awareness brings us to that sense of gratitude.
100%
for being together. Yeah.
Yeah. And then taking that gratitude and saying, okay, I'm not just going to say thank you, but I am also going to try to find ways to, pay you back.
Well, Brandon, this was an interesting conversation. Meet the Neighbors, your new book, Animal Minds and Life in a More Than Human World. I think more people now are thinking that way, are thinking that, hey, we're not alone, and it doesn't have to be an alien form. It's just the animal outside who maybe we, fail to recognize more often than not, but they're there. They're there.
I agree completely. And are there any animal neighbors in your own life who are special?
Oh yeah. There's like mourning doves flying through here that nest on our roof. There's, all the other, songbirds who come through on their flight, north and south. There's cranes, sandhill cranes around here. There's, we don't have deer though. We used to have, when we lived in the other place, we used to have deer, but sometimes there's a fox, those darn fox. Wonderful. Yeah. But I did, the simple things like, are you going to eat them? Are you going to be kind to them? Are you going to use them? Are you going to wear them? Right?
Be kind. Just be kind.
Brandon, I appreciate you being on the PETA podcast. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed this so much. Thank you.
Brandon Keim, his new book, Meet the Neighbors, published by Norton, Animal Minds and Life in a More Than Human World. Brandon Keim is the author of Meet the Neighbors. He's a journalist. Enjoyed talking to him about his new book. He's also a Filipino-American, and we talked about all the favorite Filipino foods we no longer eat because of our respect for the animals. Look for Meet the Neighbors, his new book, wherever books are sold. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of the show to your friends. Tell them you liked the PETA podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter, or X as it's known, at emilamok, or see my vlog at amok.com, or my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. And get this podcast on YouTube at emilamok1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.